Is everybody else ready? So good evening, everybody, and I just want to thank you all for being here. We're here with Martin and Ashley Rose for the Center for Restorative Justice through Suffolk University. They're restorative justice specialists and facilitators, so we're really excited to have them here tonight to give us an overview of restorative practices and what that looks like in a school system and how that can be really impactful for school community. So thank you both for being here to present. I do want to acknowledge that the superintendent is also part of this webinar too. So thank you, Mr. Mulvey, for being here.
Thank you.
And we're really excited. Before we start, I just want to point out that we do have translation available. We have Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Cantonese. We have our translators, Kai Lee, who will be doing Vietnamese translation. Tina Wang will be doing Mandarin translation, and Hong Guang will be doing Cantonese translation. So thank you to the translators. So you can see the directions on this slide if you would like to have the translation service. So thank you for that, everybody. And I will turn it over to Ashley, Rose, and Martin.
All right. So welcome everyone to this parent overview. We're grateful to be here. My name is Martin Henson. There'll be a fuller introduction a little bit as we go on, and I'll pass it to you, Ash.
Awesome. My name's Ashley Rose. I'm one of the restorative justice specialists out of Suffolk University. Most of my work deals with restorative justice within the university, dealing with conflict management, race and restorative justice, but I also train clients like yourselves with a focus in schools. So I'm really excited to be here and build off of what Quincy already has going on.
All right. So we have a little bit of time for introductions. Introductions are a big part of restorative justice practices. Where we have a round where people are able to share. Now, we're not particularly in circle right now, seeing that this is a digital format and this is more of a presentation. But here's some things that we would like to know from the people who are here. You know, your name and how you want to be addressed, what brought you here, and what you would like to get out of this presentation on restorative justice, and how are the children? Kind of an open-ended question where there's no right or wrong answer. Now, we see that we have a few people here. We want to give you all the opportunity to share. Go ahead, Ash, pass to you.
Yeah, so me and Martin will start to model. You won't answer the question and how are the children until after we watch a video, but so again, just giving us your name, how you prefer to be addressed, and again, what your experience is with restorative justice, or what do you want out of this? And I'll start and then pass it to Martin. So again, my name's Ashley Rose. It's like Mary Kate. You can address me as Ash too. I'm not too picky. In regards to why I'm here today, I'm really excited to see where Quincy is going with this. It's really good to know that this isn't a new start. So we're actually bringing parents into something that's already created. So that's awesome to hear. And what I want out of this workshop is to really just hear, where are you for real as parents, as a district? What do you need from us? We're here to serve you, especially after 2020. I think needs in regards to restorative justice have changed. So I'd love to hear what your district's doing and where they're at. So Martin, I will pass it to you.
My name is Martin Henson, pronouns he, him. What brought me here is to present to you all on restorative justice. And I would just like to hear what are some of the thoughts and some of the things that you are thinking about in relation to it, and even some of the questions. Since we're going to answer the how the children question a little bit later, I'll just pass it to someone else on the screen. More, I'm gonna go with you. Pass it your way.
Okay, great. So I'm Maura Papil. I'm the Senior Director of Student Support Services. And, you know, I'm really excited about the full implementation of restorative practices. I think we're still growing. So I'm excited to bring parents in as much as possible, because I think that that'll just help us, make sure that we're practicing with fidelity. So I really appreciate the presentation tonight. Should I turn it over to somebody else?
Yes, you can name someone else on the screen.
Sure. Oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. Hang on. I'm looking at the panelists. I'm going to pass it over to Ann. Ann, you can use the chat feature to introduce yourself. So I don't think everybody can see the chat. I'm not sure. We might have to read the participants' answer from the chat to the rest of the group.
Definitely. Martin, we can also put up the slide that might allow people to answer the question and go back and forth if you want to take a picture of it.
So I'm not really sure how to do that.
Oh, no, we'll put the slide up.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, one of the things is that because we're in this format, we can't see everybody else, but they can see us. So they would have to share in the chat.
All right, I see Melissa's already going for it.
Yeah, we're just seeing the responses stream in. So thank you all for sharing. Just give it some time for everyone to get a chance to share. And for people who are just joining, we have dropped a couple of prompts in the chat to just hear from the folks in the room. And we can drop those again, just giving people a second to share some introductions. So just reading it out again, we just dropped a prompt, just hearing people's name, how they want to be addressed, and what brought you here, what you would like to get out of this presentation on restorative justice. And give it another minute or so for people to share, so everybody can see the responses and see some of the other things happening for folks in the room. Okay.
Yeah, in the meantime, I can read out some of the ones that have shown up in the chat. Folks would like resources, techniques, more formal training. They want to see what the progress has been in Quincy Public Schools thus far. Share best practices. Right now, I've heard for an age group of 8 to 10. So those are some of the things that have come across the screen.
All right, absolutely. So in the earlier prompt and part of our introductions, we had a question at the bottom that said, how are the children? And we have a short video that we want to show you to illustrate how we think about what that question is. And we're going to frame what that means for restorative justice practice that we use afterwards. So I'm going to share that out.
Among the most accomplished and fabled tribes of Africa, No tribe was considered to have warriors more fearsome or more intelligent than the mighty Maasai. It is perhaps surprising then to learn the traditional greeting that passed between Maasai warriors and how are the children. It is still the traditional greeting among the Maasai, acknowledging the high value that the Maasai always place on their children's well-being. Even warriors with no children of their own would always give the traditional answer, all the children are well, meaning, of course, that peace and safety prevail, that the priorities of protecting the young are in place, that Maasai society has not forgotten its reason for being, its proper functions and responsibilities. All the children are well means that life is good. It means that the daily struggles for existence do not preclude proper caring for their young. I wonder how it might affect our consciousness of our own children's welfare if in our culture we took to greeting each other with this daily question, and how are the children? I wonder if we heard that question and passed it along to each other a dozen times a day, if it would begin to make a difference in the reality of how the children are thought of or cared about in our own country. I wonder if every adult among us, parent and non-parent alike, felt an equal weight for the daily care and protection of all children in our communities, in our towns, in our states, and in our country. And I wonder if we could truly say without hesitation, the children are well. Yes, all the children are well.
All right, Ash, I will pass it to you. You muted.
Bound to happen after 2020, right? So this particular opening was actually from a pastor that's actually from Framingham. But the story of the Maasai warriors, as you can see, whether or not they had children of their own or they didn't have children, one thing you'll notice is it was that village concept. So right now we know Quincy is unique. No school district is the same. No school is the same. So we're going to have just a quick popcorn about if right now, if you were asked, and how are the children in Quincy, what would be your honest answer? So take a moment, think about that. And we'll have folks, whoever's monitoring the chat, let us know what's going on in the chat. If you were honestly asked, and how are the children in Quincy, what would be your reply?
Right. As people continue to think about that question and respond to it, as we relate to it in the Center for Restorative Justice, we orient ourselves in a way where we're centering experiences as opposed to systems. And we're going to take time to talk about that in a couple of slides going forward. but it's really important for our practice of restorative justice.
Again, the reason we're doing this RJ work is to really center our children at the end of the day. And I'm getting some comments in the chat that we can read out. And not all the children are well. Certain children are struggling more than others. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for chiming in. Other folks have asked, and how are the children? Could you say all the children are well? And there's no judgment in this. Grace said, I feel that the children do play together when they are within their own schools, but as they progress into other schools, they begin to break away and form friendship groups that may or may not be friendly with one another. It would seem normal to have multiple friendships. I'm more concerned about the group dynamics that come into play when other groups have formed and how inviting one can be especially different from schools, especially from different schools, my apologies. Thank you, Grace. Well, while others start to think about this, and feel free to drop it in the chat, this answer varies depending on, I know someone said some students are struggling. After 2020, this has definitely impacted how we go. Financially, some kids are doing better than others. How are they showing up emotionally? When you look at the fact that some schools might have more social emotional support than others. But again, I'm seeing a few other comments. The children are struggling, but also, you know, dare I say it, the children are also resilient. I get to sit in classrooms all the time where some of them are doing better than us because they're giving circles really young. Also, they just have these innovative brains and this energy that allows them to prosper. But how can we use restorative justice to be, one, checking in to see how the children are doing, directly hearing from them, but also making sure that we're hearing from each other, because you can't pour from an empty well. So Martin, we can push this forward, and feel free to drop answers in the chat as we look at Quincy and where you're at. All right, Martin, I'll pass this one to you. We can get going.
All right. So when we think about restorative justice at the Center for Restorative Justice, one of our sources of definition and inspiration is this little book of Race and Restorative Justice. It's by Fanya Davis. And this definition that is present here is one that centers our work. And I'll read it out. So, consonant with African and other indigenous communitarian values, restorative justice is profoundly relational and emphasizes bringing together everyone affected by wrongdoing to address needs and responsibilities and to heal the harm to relationships and community to the degree possible. While often mistakenly considered only a reactive response to harm, restorative justice is also a proactive relational strategy to create a culture of connectivity where all members of a community thrive and feel valued. So when we talk about this, there's certain things that are key phrases that we want to pull out and make sure that we can sit on a little bit. One of those is building a community where everybody can thrive and feel valued. The other is making sure that we don't use things as only a reactive response to harm, but as a proactive relational strategy. And we want to have communitarian values. A lot of that is rooted from indigenous practices, which we'll talk a bit about in the upcoming slide. But these are the things that we're building into the culture of our schools and the institutions that we exist in that were not quite there before. And as we go forward, we'll talk about what the difference is moving from a conventional system or traditional system to one that is more restorative. But this definition centers how we think about it. Right. Ash, I'll pass to you.
Thank you, Martin. And one of the things, especially when Martin talked about it being a proactive approach, the first time your young people see circles, or even yourself, should not be when harm occurs. They should be seeing these circles. Hopefully you're doing open house in circles. Maybe it's your orientation. So when parents meet each other, this is something that they're familiar with. I think this is a really huge start. So shout out to Quincy Public Schools for bringing parents in. But again, this is something that needs to happen consistently, because if I'm sitting in orientation with you and I'm next to you, and then our students have an issue come December, we can solve that in circle versus across a desk where it really looks at a punitive approach. So that's something that we want you to keep at the forefront. You have to build community, and you can build community while dealing with harm. And actually, I think sometimes it's about once you go through conflict, you can really start building community. So we're really excited that we're getting that work done, and we're talking to parents and not just teachers and admin. In regards to the modern context of how did we get here, restorative justice is indigenous, as Martin stated before. If you think about it, there are Irish Celtic circles, there are African cosmology circles. I know that in Korea, they have something called the Gang Sule, where women sing under full moons about their pain and move into joy. I'm an athlete. The circle is sacred. The huddle is sacred. There are prayer groups. There are kids in games. They play circle. They play hand games in circle. K1, they tell story time all the way into second grade. People use these circles. There's something that happens in the third grade where we go from this communal circle type of community to this competitive nature where you're now competing for seats. You're competing for who's getting into the class that's gifted. Third graders, naturally, they do in and out groups. But we as parents tend to allow that to happen, and as admin and teachers. But what we realized after a while was that we needed to bring these practices back into schools. Students are feeling isolated. We see this from suicide attempts to children who just feel like they don't seem to belong, even with social media. So after we realized that this worked both within indigenous practices, it's worked in prison systems, we eventually realized by giving people circles in prison, it worked, but you were too late by that. And that's when it really started to be reflected in the classrooms. Fania Davis, the first slide that you've seen, that's actually the sister of Angela Davis. And she sat as a judge, a lawyer, but also she's responsible for a lot of that work that's happening out in Oakland, where they're leaning more towards social workers and social practices instead of just having the punitive approaches that are in our schools now, whether it's from officers or just the high rates of suspensions. And we know through practicing it is that by giving people more circles, we're avoiding suspensions, we're increasing test scores, and it's changing the way we teach altogether. So Martin, would you like to jump in on this one?
Oh, no, it was all well said.
Awesome. And again, this isn't some new process or practice. Something I would just add, I started teaching restorative justice in 2010. I was one of those people who served 2.5 terms of AmeriCorps. I was pretty crazy as a college young person, but what I realized was by doing this through Peace Games, I saw change happen in front of me. So this isn't some new concept. Again, it's just now being funded. They're starting to use the noun a little more. But what you'll know is that these practices have been used from the beginning of time, but also some of your teachers over the years have done this. So we're going to look at how that differs from the traditional sense of how some of us went to school, but what are those restorative approaches that some of us have experienced, but we're looking at conventional versus restorative. And Martin, I'll pass it to you to lay it out.
So we've been mentioning a few different terms throughout this conversation, talking about circle and then restorative justice, and then we defined out what restorative justice means, but we want to make sure that you know what that looks like in practice. Circle is a tool of restorative justice where everyone sits in a circle physically and they get to see each other and speak and all have an equal chance to be heard, as well as be a part of whatever the discussions and conversations are going forward. It's a manifestation of that definition we gave earlier. So what that looks like, the retributive system, or conventional, we might say traditional, the system that we currently exist in, which is marked by this kind of orangish color circle here, there are key questions that it tends to ask. What rule was broken, who broke it, and what punishment is deserved? The restorative approach which moves from the definition that we explained earlier, asks these questions. It asks, who was harmed? What are the needs of those involved? And how can harm be repaired? So when we look at situations that happen in the school environment pretty often, let's say violation of the dress code, let's pick a rule. What rule was broken? Well, they didn't follow the dress code. Who broke it? The student that wore the outfit that was out of the norm for dress code, and what punishment is deserved. Sometimes you might see a suspension, expulsion, and there might be some sort of in-school consequence. But a restorative approach will ask different questions. It asks who was harmed. Let's say someone comes in and they're not dressed appropriately. Was there any direct harm to anybody? Maybe not. Maybe that student might have been cold. Maybe that was the only thing that they had available for them to wear that day. What are the needs of those involved? So if they're in violation of the dress code, they might need, let's say if it's a belt, they may need to have something off of their head that they can't have. Just opportunity to give them something as a substitute for whatever they have on now. And how can that be repaired? By, okay, maybe we have, let's say if they violate the dress code by not having a belt, we have belts in the office, or maybe they have an outfit that's deemed inappropriate for whatever reason, and there's something restorative in the office or something that can be a substitute for what they have on that doesn't require them to be removed from the school environment to solve that problem. So you get to look at it in a more person-centered way, where you're looking at what the experience is of the people involved, if that's in this individual sense, as opposed to the retributive approach. Just ask who broke the rule, which rule was it, and what do you do in response to that? Go ahead, Ash.
Yeah, just to give an example, sometimes what I see with young ones, let's say it was a dispute on the playground, a push fight, one of those situations. Oftentimes it's your rule was broken, keep your hands to yourself, you push them, and the assumption that what happened also. And this is a punishment deserved. There's no recess. You're getting sent home for 3 days, depending on if you're like in 8th grade or whatever, or how your school operates. We're in a restorative approach. We're like, okay, who was harmed? You guys were friends 2 minutes ago, and now you're fighting, right? So who's harmed here is each and every one of you, but also the class around you. I had to stop class, stop the kickball game. So all of us are being impacted by this. And what are the needs of those involved? Okay, so the person who got pushed needs to feel like they're safe. The person who actually pushed the other person really needs to realize that their needs might be, how do I end up really being introduced to some restorative practices or some sort of tools that allow me to keep my cool, but also the needs of the parents. A parent might feel like, okay, I need to make sure my kid is safe in this school. And so how are we using circle practice to hear that parent's voice, but also hear from the other parent that really wants their kid not to be villainized or due to the situation, and looking at how this can be repaired. Oftentimes, parents, when I was in school, this went to the principal and the principal determined what was going to happen. But in a restorative approach, the two parents, along with the students, and maybe the teacher and the admin folks would decide what's the best way to go forward with this. Oftentimes, principals are asking for 3 days out, and some of the kids are like, I just wanted a sorry. That was it. An apology would have sufficed for this. So realizing it could be used so many ways so that we're avoiding some of the extreme punishment for things that could have been more of a conversation. So Martin, I think now we actually get to see how it impacts schools or schools that are already implementing this type of work. I just want to shout Quincy out because there are places where this work's being done before we look at a school district like DC. Right now, I know that they have two each school, they're near two. They have various folks that are trained in Tier 1 practices to build community. So that's really awesome that that's going on. Also, they started using various tools that get this done. I know that they have Circle Forward, which is one of the books written by Carolyn Boyes Watson, who's my boss, but also she's at the forefront of this restorative justice movement. They're using that as a springboard to create their own personalized circles that are really reflective of Quincy. They're starting to actually do something what most districts don't do. They're trying to get the parents on board, because they can do circle work all day from 9 to 3. But if they're sending their kids home to you and you're now using an unrestorative approach, it kind of undoes everything that they did from 9 to 3. So if we can kind of create an arch that goes full circle, we're all speaking the same language. Also, just thinking about it this way, I know I'm a parent of a young person who has ADHD. I know when I show up to an IEP meeting, I am teeth out. You're not going to judge my kid across the table. Don't tell me about how my son learns. But if it was done in circle practice where there were questions like, hey, what's a strength that Sage brings to the table? What do you view as a strength? What's a challenge that Sage is having? First looking at it, telling me what my son's disability is, right? The conversation changes so that we're no longer across the table defending ourselves. We're now in circle to figure out how do we truly support my son, first label him. So these are just various ways that circle practice can be used. But now we're going to watch a school district that's implementing it on various levels. So I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Restorative justice is an approach to building community and responding to harm, with roots in Indigenous traditions. Schools across the country are applying these strategies to manage classrooms and create inclusive, socially connected, and supportive learning environments.
DC is facing a lot of transition in a multitude of ways that really impact our community. We're facing retention. We're facing the evaluation system of teachers. We're facing gentrification. We're facing poverty. We're facing violence.
Restorative practices can be used to address many needs in a school. Proactive practices include community building, academic instruction, and social-emotional skill building.
As a teacher, I try my best to think of restorative justice as a way of communicating better with my students. So every Monday we had a morning circle. So whether it was just a check-in for about 5 to 10 minutes, we use it as a proactive circle.
The idea is that they're creating a community within their classrooms that everybody feels accountable to. And so when things do go wrong, they come back to the circle and they're able to discuss it in a way that helps repair any damage that has been done to keep things like that from happening again.
We are teaching children to advocate for themselves and the communities in which they will eventually serve and lead. By allowing voice to the conversation, we're teaching young people that your feelings are genuine and important.
Well, before I did the program, I didn't really feel comfortable talking in front of a lot of people and telling them, like, expressing how I felt about stuff. But when I started the program, it's easier to be open and, explain how I feel about a certain topic.
Responsive practices bring together those involved in a significant incident of harm to understand what happened, agree on how to repair harm, and rebuild trust.
Schools are really rethinking, what does discipline mean and when does it need to be utilized and for what purpose? We realize that a student who is outside of the school is not learning. And if we continue to exclude students from their learning environment due to discipline, we continue to put the students often who need us most further and further behind. Restorative justice has been used as an alternative to exclusionary practices by really thinking about how to restore the harm that was caused to the community. Sitting at home never restores the harm. It never allows you to sit across the table from your peer and talk about what led you to the actions that you did. What we've learned is that in schools that are implementing restorative practices with fidelity, it's often not the students who need changing, it's actually the adults in the building.
This work really required me to be reflective about the things that I say, things that I do, and how I interact with kids and adults.
A lot of times with restorative justice, someone is offended and there's offenders. But a lot of times things are misconstrued because of miscommunication.
And it opened the conversation and dialogue for students to begin to talk to one another and resolve conflict effectively.
You just see what's going on, but you don't know what's actually going on in a person's life or what they're going through. So it's be open and hear people out.
Part of those restorative practices training is learning what your biases are so that you aren't using your bias as a way to punish, as a way to exile, and not be inclusive.
In one of the schools that we work with, a Caucasian student, stated to a student of color that they didn't belong at that school because of misconduct in violation of rules. And what we were able to do was have a conversation with the staff about what was our feelings about hearing that and what work needed to be done. Gentrification is an issue in DC, and what does that look like? What's the impact on the community?
If you have no prior knowledge of dealing with someone in a certain culture, you come with your own preconceived ideas. Same thing with children with learning differences. Again, you can come with your own ideas behind ADHD, for example. That child doesn't know how to be still.
Restorative practices ensure that students who experience trauma receive vital support to address harm and make necessary connections to academic and social services.
The trauma cycles from generation to generation, but what we see in the classroom, anger, depression, and with kids, especially this age, the depression looks like anger.
We have children who are helping parents with babysitting. We have children who are seeing abuse at home. We have children who have drug abuse going on at home.
The use of RJ practices can be used to help students who have experienced trauma to be able to talk about that, to be able to share their experiences. I think for a lot of students, the beginning of an emotional release and emotional healing.
It helps with that key element of bringing humanity back into the schools, assisting with the belongingness that kids are struggling with at this stage of life. How restorative justice helps with that is just acknowledging that, sure, you made an infraction, you made a mistake. We all make them. You're not that mistake, you're not that infraction.
If you did something, it's probably something that's like at home or somewhere else, and it's not even the school. It's just, that's how they reacted, because some people keep stuff in, some people don't talk, some people vent. So different people handle their issues different.
We have to bring humanity back to education, and I think that's one thing that's really missing. We're looking at students like a number, which is replicated in our justice system. I think when we're able to do that, I think we'll actually see the positives. It is painful in the beginning because you have to do some stuff that you're uncomfortable with.
What is a challenge to restorative implementation is not only mindset, but time. It is much easier to send a student home by writing a letter and attaching it to the child's file for a suspension. And I think that school leaders have to position themselves as to what is the greater investment of time. Is the greater investment to do the quick fix that continues not to work? Or is the greater investment to spend the time up front setting the conditions for long-term success that actually will sustain you into the future?
Restorative practices reduce suspensions, expulsions, and loss of instruction time that have a disproportionate impact on minority students. Restorative practices also increase teacher retention, create a positive school climate, and improve student satisfaction and safety.
When I first got here, this was the most challenging middle school, and DCPS had the highest suspension rate of every other middle school in the city. We are now, I would say, at the top where the schools in the other part of town who don't have discipline issues, we rank up there with them as it relates to school climate and culture.
Awesome, Martin, thank you for that overview. And I think that video allows us to see the full scope of why restorative justice is important, not just for the students. Oftentimes I get hey, let's put the kids in circle, let's put the kids in circle, let's put the teachers in circle, let's put our admin in circle. So we're figuring out, how are we keeping our good teachers in the district? I've watched some great teachers, because they were so stressed out, leave teaching for technology. How are we making sure that we're using circle to check in with our staff? I think some of to answer some people's questions that I saw in the chat as we went on, in regards to getting the real tools for restorative justice, we're going to have to see you in a tier 1 training. We offer 2 8-hour days for people to really dive into this work, get all the various tools so you can figure out, how do I apply this to my 8th grade class or my elementary school class? So I think that's where you're going to get the real tools. This would just be an overview for you. I also think the schools that I've seen do the real the real work and the real training. They didn't only have a parent overview, they eventually got parents trained in circle process. So you can have what's called a restorative leadership team eventually, where you have a few parents, a few teachers, even a few students, all educated on what restorative justice is, and they're working together to figure out how does it work at your school. You're supported here where your district actually believes in it. It's just not like one person who shows up trying to do it for a whole school. So thinking about getting your students trained, trust me, they know how to have circles on recess, at recess. I've seen it happen. Once trained, like, hold on. You know what? You stole the kickball in this one. We got to have a quick circle. And they'll start to use the language and realize that you don't owe everything doesn't have to be a circle. I like to say that restorative justice isn't circle. It's just one of the tools that could be used to get this done. And also making sure that you're having fun circles. Like I taught peace games. So could we use the circle to have some games so that if I am going to get in trouble in 2 weeks, at least I already like the circle process. So Martin, I'll pass it back to you to chime in or bring it where you would like.
Yeah, all of that was great. And just want to give people a chance to just ask some questions. We dropped some pretty heavy or seemingly heavy topics as it relates to the use and implementation of restorative justice. So what are some questions that you have? We'd love to see you drop some of those in the chat. In this video that we just showed, I'll drop the link to that in the chat as well. So you can have it if you want to review and watch it again or share it with other people. But what are some questions that you all are having? Is there anything that's coming up? Because you know that this may seem different, and you're not obligated to just feel ready for it in this moment right now. There just might be some things that you have reservations around. You know, we want to be able to acknowledge that that's real and give you a chance to discuss that a little bit.
And as you're even using the chat, as like Martin said, think about immediate things, but also long-term. I see something in the chat. Some are sheltered. Okay, some are sheltered with their friend circle and environment. It would be great if we can instill open-mindedness with different situations, be it race, gender. So yeah, how do we encourage being open-minded, and how do we expose children to being open-minded? Definitely, I think that that's something that restorative justice in circle can start to open up that conversation about awareness. Like again, how do we have a conversation that doesn't necessarily have the call out feature, but it's a call in? We start talking about things like race, having conversations. There's a big difference between me celebrating my race and racism, right? How do we separate the two while we could still move forward? I think that we're always starting at the worst point and not being able to come back in. So, and also open-mindedness, Circle totally supports the 5 castle components, right? We start to look at social awareness, self-management. Kids become, if you start to ask them various questions about their culture, having open house in Circle can really make a difference, even how your teachers educate what their curriculum is. So just realizing, especially in this, I think this age where kids are so mixed up. So I think even meeting your families and realizing, oh, you know what? This young person is Black and Jewish. Okay, so maybe my curriculum is not just going to focus on Christmas this year. Maybe I'm going to make sure that I add a little bit of Hanukkah to this, but also make sure that when I'm looking at my curriculum and how I'm decorating my classroom, is it reflective of your students? I think a big high five I'll give to Quincy is you're actually having this in multiple languages. You don't know how unrestorative it is for someone to have an open house or a webinar and no one's translating at all, or there isn't even the option to acknowledge that. So some of the restorative things aren't about being in circle, it's about being in circle while you're in square. So again, I think the open-mindedness, it happens, it's not the first circle, trust me. It's by June and the kids learn these SEL skills that they start to realize, you know what, I did judge you, or because you were different than what my mom is, I did think this way, but they start to change and you see it happen in front of you. Martin, I'll pass it back to you to see if there's more in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. Somebody said that we mentioned circle as one of the tools. What other tools can you suggest? And I just want to jump off the back of what Ash was saying, is that restorative justice is about an orientation of creating a proactive relational strategy, bringing people together with communitarian values, to reference that definition that I said earlier. And I only know these things off the top of my head because I've went through that definition so many times, but you'll start to feel what the difference is like when the language shifts start to change. And that's one thing that we talk about in our different tiers of training is changing the language. Talk about mediation is something that a lot of places have. It's a restorative practice. It does not necessarily circle. So any way that brings people back into community and creates community as a foundation is a restorative practice. It doesn't have to necessarily be a circle, but circle is one of those ways that you can do that.
Absolutely. And I had some questions in the chat, I think about teacher buy-in and how it's been on the high school level. I can't speak for Quincy directly. When I'm looking at, the question was, has there been noticeable improvements in a climate within the high school since Quincy Public Schools has started talking about restorative justice? How is the buy-in from teachers, staff, and admin? I'll let the folks who are part of the admin team answer this, but what I can tell you is there's going to be no buy-in from teachers. Teachers need believe-in. They have been sold enough initiatives over the last few years. Trust me, I've been funded by them when it was peace building. Right now it's DEI, whatever the new buzzword is, right? But in order to get teachers on board, they're going to have to see that that child changed. And it's going to be that time period where you come in and you're sharing in a circle, like, you know what? Jake actually listened this time in circle. I realized he wasn't just being a jerk. He actually lost his best friend yesterday, but because we actually took the time to ask him and not sit back, things totally changed. I would also say that the changes at a high school level, if you did it for 2 years, it's still too early on. It takes 3 to 5 years for a school to become a restorative school versus even a restorative district. You're going to have to figure out, what are the policy changes? Like Martin talked about, is the hoodie a suspension or not? When we talk about creating these values for our schools, where like the core values are respect, integrity, community. Have you really explored what respect means to me, or did you just define it on your own? So really starting to dig into that knit and grit, I think takes about 3 to 5 years. But I'll actually, and someone asked about data and changes. I don't know if Quincy has recorded this, but in regards to schools that have done really great jobs that I've worked with, some of them have what's called a restorative reflection form. We'll teach you about what's called the restorative. I see some head nodding, so I think some folks have restorative reflection forms. And I've seen where in September, there were 200 restorative reflection forms where kids are getting sent to the office, and now they start to answer these questions. And you'll see if they actually keep the stack, that some of those kids who come in 7 times a month in September and all the way into December might only be showing up 2 times come February, because they're actually mastering these tools. They're learning how to self-regulate. You'll also realize some things that you were suspending kids for really could have been circles. They really could have been a conversation. And likewise with your teachers. I often say, does everything have to be a pink slip? Can we have a conversation? So Morris, should I pass this to you to talk about how Quincy's, some examples of where you're seeing this being done, or if anybody in the admin wants to jump in?
Sure. So all the school improvement plans, all the principals have put a goal for social emotional learning and restorative practices in their school improvement plans. And that happened like last year too. So we're really using the restorative framework in order to deliver the SEL as well. So we have like a new SEL platform. So that's like a huge rollout. So we're doing district wide. I think one really telling thing is, like, I just had offered another restorative justice training. So we trained like 100 people so far in restorative practices, in pretty intensive training. And then, we offered another cohort. So we have another cohort actually starting next week. So, I got some grant funding. So people are, asking to do that work, to be trained. I think people really appreciate, having had those conversations in those circles and community building when something happens. they're comfortable having a conversation in circle, as a response, so that they're not just using a circle when something happens. They've already done like the community building. So I think people are doing a really nice job with that. I think they appreciate it too when it's like a difficult issue, like around boundary that cross race or, gender identity or something like that. Those are hard topics to, when there's a violation of that, when there's harm around that, to have a conversation. So they're using that. And I think they're appreciative of that. I think before we would have never tried to address that kind of harm, like in like a classroom. I think we're still growing, we're still learning, we're really using that reflective form that you talked about, in instances where there's some kind of conflict or harm that's happened. We're doing it with, student and student or teacher and student. I think we need to bring parents in more. I love the idea that you mentioned about, doing like a parent training. I think that would be great. I think that parents don't understand, when you're doing a restorative chat or discussion or intervention, that there's a lot of accountability in that. So if they don't, if they feel like their child was harmed, they're not necessarily seeing a restorative intervention as they're not understanding what that really means and how impactful that is, rather than just a suspension and not resolving the issue. So, I think there's been good impact. We trained about 40 kids in each high school in restorative practices last year, but we should probably, keep that going, train kids, keep that going.
All right, so I know that we're winding down. Maura, thank you for all the information that you gave us. I just want to share your information out on the screen so that people have access if they have any further questions outside of us, and I can drop it in the chat as well. But go ahead, Ash, I got to you.
No, I was just going to say thank you, Maura, for highlighting what is being done. And again, the parent trainings make the biggest difference. But again, I think even as you create your leadership team, it's one good thing to have parents come to one training. It's another thing to put them on that team that then looks at how it's really being implemented at their individual school. That's where I've seen the real change happens. I actually seen one school that did it with such fidelity. The teacher showed up to the restorative justice meetings and the parent was running it because she was the person who really bought in the most. She had the time. She was all about it. And at the time, she wasn't even employed. And eventually they ended up hiring her at the school as the restorative coordinator. So there are people who can do this. Your community is there. You can call people like me and Martin who are paid to do this work. But I think that everything you need to make change is already there. You're just going to have to invest in it and really listen to each other. And also restorative justice has to be a budget line item. Quincy is paying. So again, this can't be one of those things where we just give people books and tell them to do it on their own. It has to be something that's built into the schedule. Teachers need the time to do this. There need to be people who can actually hold these circles. Every teacher can't stop their class to hold a circle. It's just not going to happen. But who are those people that will be able to do it? And it doesn't fall on the social worker's back. So again, we have a lot of implementation aspects to go through, but it seems like you're on the right track right now. So I'll pass it back to you, Martin.
Right. So as we heard earlier, Quincy is in year 2. It normally takes about 4 years to complete a full implementation of a whole school in restorative justice. And what that means is that the next sort of training over the next few years won't be us coming in. As you all build your capacity, it'll be people from your community that have bought in and then found ways to practice it, from parents to students to admins. So we want to thank you all for your time. I'm really excited for the things that I'm seeing being done out there. Again, my name is Martin Henson. I'm from the Center for Restorative Justice at Suffolk. And I will hopefully hear good things from more in the future.
Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. You're great. Really appreciate it. Some good ideas I'm going to take away.
Definitely. Thank you all.
All right. Y'all have a good rest of your evening.
You too.
Take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye, everyone.